Imagine this. World War I wasn't just fought in the trenches, with artillery shells raining down and soldiers charging with bayonets. No, the war had another battlefield, one invisible to most, yet just as deadly. The offices of banks, the halls of central banks, the buzzing floors of stock exchanges. While millions of men bled on the front lines, governments and financiers were calculating, negotiating, and manipulating money. The financial decisions they made didn't just determine victory or defeat, they rewired the global economy in ways that still affect us today. By the summer of 1914, Europe was already a powder keg. National rivalries, colonial ambitions, and tangled alliances had turned the continent into a chessboard of paranoia. Speeches about honor and empire filled the air, but underneath there was a brutal truth. War on this scale was unimaginably expensive. Armies, weapons, and supplies cost more than anyone had ever imagined. And with war came debt. Debt that ordinary citizens would unknowingly shoulder for decades. Leaders at the outset thought it would be short. Maybe by Christmas they hoped the war would be over. Gold, limited borrowing, patriotic donations, they assumed these would be enough. But within weeks, it became painfully clear. The old ways of funding were hopeless. Millions of men were mobilized, factories switched to weapons production, and the money burned faster than anyone could keep up with. Germany alone was spending over 10 million marks per day. Britain's costs climbed to £2.5 million every single day. The math was merciless. Gold reserves, once the backbone of the financial system, could not sustain such expenditure. The solution? Governments abandoned the rules. One by one, the major powers suspended the gold standard, quietly admitting that money was no longer anchored in metal but in faith. Faith in the state, in propaganda, and in promises. That moment, when gold no longer defined currency, was seismic. It showed how fragile real wealth really was. From that point forward, money could be created, lent, and manipulated in ways previously unimaginable. The world had stepped into a new era, one where paper, credit, and persuasion were more powerful than metal and tradition. And then the real financial war began. Germany, isolated from international capital markets and blockaded by the Royal Navy, had only one option: domestic borrowing. The government launched massive bond drives, appealing to patriotism. Posters glorified soldiers and families were urged to sacrifice luxuries for the fatherland. Promises of repayment after victory flooded the public discourse. In total, Germany raised over 100 billion marks this way, but it was a pyramid built on hope. When the war ended in defeat, those bonds were worthless, wiping out the savings of millions and creating fertile ground for extremism. Economic wounds once inflicted take decades to heal. Britain, on the other hand, had one immense advantage: the City of London. Its financial network stretched across the globe, and sterling was trusted worldwide. Initially, the government relied on short-term borrowing and patriotic appeals, but very quickly it tapped into deeper pools of global credit, and crucially, it turned to the United States. America, officially neutral in 1914, became the lifeline for Britain and France. Wall Street firms managed vast loans, facilitating purchases of weapons, food, and raw materials. By the time the US entered the war in 1917, it had already been financing the Allies for years. This was not charity, it was power. American banks earned millions in fees, and the United States transformed from a debtor nation into the world's financial leader. This is where the American century begins, not on the battlefield, but in the ledgers of Wall Street. France faced a different struggle. Already weakened by defense spending and haunted by memories of the Franco-Prussian War, it relied heavily on loans from domestic savers and international financiers, particularly across the Atlantic. Citizens, eager to contribute, bought bonds, while deeper funding came from America. France became increasingly dependent on foreign capital, a dependency that would haunt the nation politically and economically for years to come. Russia, meanwhile, was the picture of financial chaos: a vast empire with underdeveloped infrastructure, a fragile banking system, and gold reserves that looked impressive on paper, but were insufficient in practice. Russia borrowed heavily from allies like France, but repeated military defeats, inflation, and loss of public confidence in the ruble drove the economy to collapse. By 1917, the Tsarist regime fell, not just because of ideology or incompetent generals, but because the financial system had been pushed past the breaking point. Money and power marched together, shaping history as much as any army ever could. The scale of the financial mistakes during the war was staggering. By 1918, the Allied powers had spent more than $140 billion, while the Central Powers had spent $60 billion, amounts far exceeding the pre-war national incomes of the nations involved. The gold standard was shattered, inflation ripped through economies, and Germany spiraled into hyperinflation, with prices soaring to billions of marks for basic goods. Ordinary people, workers, small savers, middle-class families, bore the brunt of these financial shocks. Meanwhile, wealthy elites often shielded themselves, moving assets abroad or converting them into tangible goods. The lesson was clear. In a financial war, the small saver bleeds first. The consequences didn't end with the armistice. The United States, flush with gold and credit, now held the world's largest reserves and creditor position in history. Europe, once the heart of global finance, was drowning in debt. Britain owed the US over $4 billion, France over $3 billion, and smaller nations were entangled in obligations they could never realistically repay. Wall Street had become the world's new financial capital, surpassing London in influence without firing a single shot. But the aftermath was a trap. Wars funded by borrowing create their own wars, wars of repayment, austerity, and financial manipulation. The Treaty of Versailles demanded that Germany pay 132 billion gold marks in reparations, a sum designed to punish and cripple the defeated nation. But it was a fantasy. Germany simply could not pay, and attempts to do so, including massive money printing, only destabilized its economy further. The hyperinflation of 1923, with Germans hauling wheelbarrows of worthless notes for bread, was a direct consequence of debts created during the war. These economic wounds festered, sowing seeds of anger and extremism that would shape the decades to come. Britain tried to restore its financial prestige by returning to the gold standard in 1925, pegging the pound at its pre-war value. It was an economic disaster. The industrial base was weakened, debts were towering, and forcing the pound back to its old parity caused deflation, unemployment, and social unrest. Winston Churchill, then Chancellor, would later be remembered for this staggering miscalculation. Again, ordinary citizens paid, while elites clung to illusions of restored greatness. Meanwhile, the United States faced a new challenge: what to do with its unprecedented financial dominance. American banks lent money back to Europe, which lent it to Germany so Germany could pay reparations to Britain and France, who could then repay their debts to the US. It was a financial merry-go-round that looked stable but was built on circular logic. When the Great Depression struck, the entire structure collapsed. The world had never been more financially interconnected and more fragile. This is why World War I is not just a military story. It was a turning point in economic history, teaching governments they could finance the unimaginable by suspending gold, borrowing, printing, and persuading citizens it was all necessary. Every modern crisis, from the stagflation of the 1970s to the 2008 financial crash, carries echoes of 1914. The same patterns, the same illusions, the same sacrifices of ordinary people persist. Real wealth is not numbers on a screen or promises from politicians. Real wealth is knowledge, resilience, and the ability to see through illusions. History teaches us that when the guns fall silent, the war continues in the balance sheets. Every financial crisis since has followed a playbook written in 1914. Those in power protect themselves. Those without knowledge are sacrificed. History tells us the truth. If you like this story, hit subscribe, and I'll show you exactly where to look.